Good afternoon, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. We're just past 1 o'clock hour. Thanks for joining the webinar today. We have Sarah Mills, as you can see on the screen. She's going to talk about wind energy in rural communities. But first, I'm Tyler Williams. I'm an extension educator at the University of Nebraska. And I first want to mention that this webinar is brought to you by NC3. It's the North Central Climate Collaborative, which is an initiative of the North Central Region Water Network. Just a few housekeeping things before we get going and let people kind of gather in here. Before I formally introduce our speaker, I wanted to mention that there will be a couple pop-up survey questions. So there'll be 2 questions at the beginning and then 2 questions at the end. I'll leave them open for about 5 to 10 minutes just to try to get everyone's responses, and then I'll pull them back down. So if you do have a question throughout the webinar, we'll pause a few times in between. And so you can type those into the chat box or into the Q&A, and I'll try to keep an eye on that. And like I said, we'll pop in and look at questions here a couple times through the webinar, but will there also be time at the end too if something comes up that you want to ask at the end? We'll definitely leave some time to do that. I think that's it for now on the front end of this. This is recorded, so we'll have a recording of this on the NC3 webpage after this. So you'll be able to find it there if you want to refer back to anything that's mentioned. I now want to formally introduce Sarah Mills. She's a senior project manager at the University of Michigan's Gerald Ford School of Public Policy. She's going to present data from some surveys that they sent out with over 3,200 landowners and 10 Michigan townships with these wind farms in order to provide a little insight on the effects of the wind turbines on the local communities, not just how it looks aesthetically, but the effects of the wind turbines on farm incomes, local government services, relationships, all the things that we tend to hear about. She'll also discuss the advice she shares with other communities that are considering putting wind turbines in their area and the extent to which the lessons from Michigan can hopefully apply to other locations of where we're at across the region. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pull up the first polling question. Go ahead and fill that out whenever you see it. And I will go ahead and turn it over to Sarah.
Thanks so much, Tyler, and thanks for inviting me to present today. All right, so let's see if I can make this go. There we go. Okay, so what I first thought I would do is kind of tell you what I'll cover. So first, I'm going to give an overview of wind development in Michigan because I think that there are some nuances that you may be able to compare and contrast with your own state. I'll talk about the surveys that I conducted with landowners, and specifically I've divided that into 2 sections, individual impacts and the community impacts of wind projects. I will tell you the lessons that I've shared with communities that have invited me to, understand the pros and cons of wind development. Then I want to spend just a few minutes talking about a project that I've worked on this summer on predicting contention, how contentious wind development is going to be. And the reason being is that project is looking beyond Michigan. And then some just quick concluding thoughts. But first, to lay the groundwork, I thought I'd give you a little bit more background on where I'm coming from. So my PhD is in land use policy. Specifically, I came back to graduate school to study farmland preservation. And my dissertation was really to investigate claims that were being made throughout Michigan that wind energy was a farmland preservation tool. Most of the data that I'm going to share with you, though, is from a grant that I got from CS Mott Foundation, or was made possible from a grant from the CS Mott Foundation, that was trying to take the lessons learned from Michigan wind farms to share it back with those communities that were considering whether or not to welcome wind. In Michigan, we've seen 2 very different reactions towards wind farms, either communities eagerly welcoming more or saying enough is enough. And so the goal of this was really to ensure that future wind development respects local community values. So part of this was, what I did was an extension-like roadshow, because University of Michigan is certainly not our land grant institution here, to communities in Michigan to try to serve as a neutral broker. I think that's what they were most interested in. I talked about pros and cons, and that's what I'll do today. But also to share some state-based data, because I don't know, people like to know what was going on in communities that they had heard of before. Okay, so effectively what I'm going to share with you are some of the excerpts from that, or a good number of the excerpts from that. But first, here's an overview of wind development in Michigan. So to kind of set the stage, we have over 900 turbines in the state. It's about 22 utility scale wind farms. I've only shown the wind farms with over 10 megawatts of capacity. And that wind development is in 8 counties. I'm going to point out a couple places here in the thumb. We have about a third, just over a third of the wind development in the state. And that's important. Most of my data comes from there, but I've also studied this wind farm here and this wind farm up in our Upper Peninsula. If you haven't been to Michigan or don't know what the landscape looks like, here's a couple shots of wind farms. So we are not West Texas. We have, our wind farms are pretty well integrated into the community. You know, every farmer has a turbine or two on their property. Oh, and here are some questions. Okay, let's see. Oh, and there's another shot of a wind farm in the thumb. Okay, so the way wind development happens across the country starts out pretty much the same. Here's your hypothetical rural area. The wind developer goes in and tries to get landowners to sign exploratory leases. Those leases lock the landowner into working with that developer for a set period of time in exchange for a small sum of money. Usually it's on a per acre basis. Once the wind developer feels that they have enough land under contract, they take that information back to the engineers and you know, apply a number of other constraints. Because I'm interested in land use, the key one that I talk about is zoning, but there's certainly other things. You know, they have to get FAA approval. They do wind studies with Met towers. They do lots of other things. And then they decide at the end of the day where the turbines are going. In the traditional wind business model, it's only those landowners who have a turbine on their property whose lease is really extended for a longer period of time. Usually that lease sometimes it has 2 components. In Michigan, it often has 2 components. One is on a per acre basis for the land that's disturbed. So the land that's taken out of production to, you know, put the actual pad for the turbine up, and also the access road to get to it. And that's actually what takes more of the land out of production. It often also includes a royalty component. So that is a percentage of the profits that are made by selling the wind energy that's generated to the grid. So that's the traditional business model. In Michigan now, though, the model that they're moving towards is to not just pay those landowners who get a turbine on their property at the end of the day, but to pay everyone who initially signed an exploratory lease. So the landowner with a turbine would still get paid on a per acre basis for the land that's taken out of production, but everyone would share in that royalty portion of the payment based on how many acres they originally signed up. So whether or not you have a turbine, if you put in 100 acres, you would get the same portion of the royalty out at the end. So I assume that it's the same amount of money that's going into landowner payments in either the traditional model or this new model, but that it's just more people that are getting paid. So the people with turbines on their property are just getting a little bit less because they're sharing some with their neighbors. An even newer innovation that is not widely practiced in Michigan, but we do have a couple wind developers practicing it, is to have something called a friendly neighbor or a participation agreement. So this is with people who have plots of land that are too small to feasibly site a turbine on. They're not going to be approached initially to seek out the feasibility of building a turbine because you're not going to put a turbine there anyway. These participation agreements are for free access to the wind that blows over your property. In Michigan, it's also because we have a lot of local zoning ordinances that distinguish between participating and non-participating landowners. So from the wind developer's perspective, you get more participants in the model. And right now, these participation agreements are roughly $1,000 per landowner per year. Regardless of which model is practiced, though, everyone in the community indirectly benefits because wind developers are paying personal property taxes, which in Michigan go to the local government units. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. It amounts to $20 million statewide over our 900 turbines. That works out to about $22,000 per turbine per year. But it's treated as personal property like any other industrial equipment, so it depreciates over time. So what the state recommends is that the wind developer is assessed 100% in year 1 and 30% by year 10, and then 30% year on. I'm gonna talk about that a little bit later, but just wanted to foreshadow that. So the most money that a local government would receive is in the first year, and they're still receiving something, 10 years down the road, but just not nearly as much as in the first year. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about my survey data, and then I'm going to pause just a minute in case there are questions. So Tyler, I'm going to let you know 2 slides from now, I think, is when I'll take a break. Okay, so the survey data that I'm going to share with you is from two surveys. Most of it is coming from this 2016 community survey that I mentioned was funded by the Mott Foundation. This survey went out to all owners of land that's assessed agricultural or residential. It's in 10 townships in Michigan. We do have civil townships. They have zoning authority if they so choose. If not, it goes to the county. And so that's among the reasons why the township is my unit of analysis. So you can see that 7 of my townships are here in Huron County where there's lots of wind. There's another 2 townships here in kind of the northern Michigan portion, and then 1 township in the Upper Peninsula. And you can't quite see because it's not blue, but this again is all, this is Lake Michigan, just so you have some sense of that there is, this project really is right on the lake shore. In that survey, in the 2016 survey, I heard back from 2,000 respondents. It was 53% response rate. The balance, there's a couple slides that I'm going to take from my initial 2014 farmland survey. And so this was only sent to owners of land that was assessed agricultural. There were 14 townships that it was sent to. 9 of them here in dark blue were the same ones that I sent in the survey again to in 2016. They have wind turbines. And then I also sent it out to 5 townships here in light blue where there was no wind development proposed at that time. In this survey, I heard from 1,200 people. Because we're only talking about owners of farmland, it's a smaller pool. That was actually 72% response rate, and that was funded by an internal fellowship I had from University of Michigan. All right, are there any questions, Tyler, that I should answer before I move on?
One question is if the copy of the PowerPoint would be available after this, and I would leave that up to you. If you want to share it, we can do that.
Yes, I will. I'll put it on my website and I'll show you that URL at the end, and then you can certainly circulate it to the people on the call.
Okay. Other than that, I don't think we have any questions other than I've been messing with the poll question. So if you see that pop up and down a bunch of times, I'm sorry. We'll, go ahead and fill it out. That's it. So continue on. Thank you.
All right, very good. All right, so now I'm going to talk about the individual level impacts that wind turbines, at least there are perceptions that these things, these are potential impacts on individuals within communities with wind farms. So I'm going to walk you through this first one really close, in detail, and then you'll get how to read the rest of them. So up here is the statement that I posed on the survey: turbines create noise pollution. Over on the left, this is all of the respondents from the 2016 survey. So again, this is not just owners of farmland, this is any owner of residential or ag property in these townships with wind farms. These numbers are percentages, so 19% strongly agree that turbines create noise pollution, and you can see the agreement is above the x-axis and the disagreement is below. Over off to the left, we often hear that wind development is a haves versus have-nots, that you have different attitudes between the haves versus have-nots. And so I've broken down all of my data that way, just so you can see that whether that is indeed the case. And so here you can see overall, attitudes are roughly split 50-50 about whether turbines are noisy. 48% say they are, 52% say they're not. They don't create noise pollution. The people that are paid are more likely to disagree that turbines are noisy than those who are unpaid. But it's not completely that just because you're paid, you think turbines are silent, and that you're unpaid, you think they're noisy. Among those who are unpaid, 52% say they're noisy and 48% say they're not. So again, not completely black and white. The next statement was about whether turbines create visual or aesthetic problems. So effectively, are they ugly? Again, attitudes are split. Excuse me, 48% agree with that statement, 51% disagree. Again, there are differences between paid and unpaid respondents, but just because you are paid does not mean that you think turbines are beautiful, and just because you're unpaid doesn't mean that you think they're ugly. I did not specifically ask about daytime visual impacts versus nighttime visual impacts, but my survey leaves the entire back page blank and people write a lot of comments. And I'll tell you that I had many more comments about the nighttime impacts, the red lights at night that the FAA requires you put on towers over, I think FAA requires 200 or 300 feet. Modern wind turbines are 500 feet tall, so they're on the top of modern wind turbines. Those red lights you can see from much farther away than you can see, you know, the white blades turning during the daytime. So I'm not a person who really believes that technology is a solution to everything, but there is a technology that's approved now by FAA to turn those lights off until an aircraft gets in the vicinity. In Michigan, we have not yet had that technology deployed on any of our wind farms, but that's certainly something that communities are discussing. So there is a technology that can solve it if you're worried about the red lights at night. The next statement is turbines cause human health problems. 27% of respondents in Michigan communities with wind farms agree that turbines cause human health problems. The balance, 72% disagree. This is a good place to see. I've seen my numbers add up to 99 here rather than 100. It's rounding error, just the 0.5s sometimes go up or down. So apologies if that's throwing anybody off. If you Google it, you'll see all different kinds of articles about wind turbine syndrome and human health impacts. I'm certainly, my research is not on the medical impacts. I'm not a medical doctor, but my reading of that research is that there is no direct link between wind turbines and human health impacts. A lot of the research right now is on whether the annoyance that's caused by hearing turbines or seeing them, or just having something in your community that you didn't want there in the first place, may lead to stress, and that stress causing physiological impacts. But again, that's not a direct link. Even so, you know, 27% in these communities say that there are health problems caused by turbines. Here's another one on perception. So 54% of people that live in or who own property in Michigan communities with wind farms say that turbines decrease nearby property values. The peer-reviewed research on this from the US finds that there is not an impact on property values, but this is, you know, perception counts here. In Michigan, we haven't had any studies to look specifically at property value impacts from our wind farms. The other thing that I want to note here is that this slide, more than any of the others, there's a bigger difference between those who are paid and those who are unpaid. So, you know, there are some people who are paid who say turbines decrease property values, but the gap is a lot bigger. And the next slide, I think, explains a little bit more why. The people in this paid category tend to own farmland because they were approached generally to host a turbine. The people in the unpaid category tend not to. And this slide shows that there may be reason to believe that wind turbine revenue may help increase the value of farmland. I shifted the orientation here because this slide is from my 2014 survey that only went out to owners of farmland. And it asked them how much they had invested in a number of categories over the past 5 years. And you'll see, getting back to my property values, one of the things that I asked about was drainage and irrigation. And the people with turbines on their property are investing a lot more in that category, and actually in any category, than any of the other groups. So I want to pause a little bit and tell you what these groups are. So these, if you recall from that first survey, went out to owners of farmland in communities that did not have wind development. And so they are all captured here in the non-wind farm community. On average, they're investing $187,000 in their farm, in these various aspects of their farm. Below the blue line are all people that live in the townships with wind development. Again, these people only are the ones who own land that's assessed as agricultural. Unpaid neighbors, these are the people in those wind farm communities who don't get a check in the mail, they invested $180,000 on average. There's no statistical difference between this group and the non-wind farm community group. Neighbors in pool are the people in that second business model where they signed a lease and they are receiving a check in the mail from the wind developer for the wind development, but they don't have a turbine on their property. And they're investing $193,000. Again, there's no statistical difference between this group and the non-wind farm group. But you can see that people with turbines on their property are investing over twice as much as any of the other categories. As I mentioned before, people with turbines on their property tend to, they tend to own more farmland. They tend to have some of the biggest farms. And so you would expect that they're going to be investing more in their farm. Even when you control for that, having a turbine on your property leads to 2.5 times as much investment in your farm than those in your reference community and then your non-wind farm neighbors. Because remember, in this non-wind farm group, there are also very large farmers. They just haven't had wind development come yet. So the idea that on-farm investment is happening as a result of wind development is true even after you control for the size of the farm. Let's see. There we go. Another question that I asked on that 2014 survey was about succession planning. Again, I'm interested in farmland preservation, and we know if you have a succession plan in place, you're more likely to keep that land farmed rather than sold for development. And here you can see that there's no difference between any of these groups except those with wind turbines on their property. They are more likely to have a succession plan in place. Anecdotes, people are telling me that, the drought-proof, pest-proof revenue that they're receiving from wind development is helping convince a younger generation of farmers that farming isn't such a risky business. In Michigan, our oldest wind farms are 10 years old. So we really haven't had time to see if this farm succession actually takes place. 10 years from now, 15 years from now, I'll be able to tell you that more definitively. But at least having a succession plan in place is a good indication that that land's going to stay actively farmed. Okay, so the takeaways from the individual level impacts are that the views on noise, visual impact, property values are really split 50-50. You could say that if you have a financial stake, you have a rosier view, or if you have no financial stake, you have a more soured view of wind development. But overall, opinions are really split. It's not black and white. Most people don't see human health impacts, but some people do. And because the purpose of zoning is to protect the public health, safety, and general welfare, these comments often come up. And I've also found that having a turbine on your property is linked to additional on-farm investment and to succession planning. Now I want to talk about the community level impacts that wind development can have. So one is on job creation. Here you can see those slides, the same kind of agree, disagree slides again. Most people, 78%, agree that wind turbines create jobs. But this question, more than any others on the survey, people would write kind of off into the margin, but not local jobs. So I always give the caveat that the jobs that have been created in Michigan, rural communities as a result of wind development, are most commonly during the construction phase. And it's actually the hospitality industry hosting out-of-town construction workers who come in to erect the turbines. There are some local companies that are hired for aggregate hauling, for bulldozing, but really it's the hospitality sectors that see the biggest impact. Our community colleges haven't been keeping up with training folks for, wind energy technician jobs. And really there aren't all that many wind energy technician jobs, even for pretty large wind farms. So wind turbines do create jobs. Local residents will tell you that, but they also often give me that caveat that they're not all local jobs that are created, and they're not necessarily long-term jobs. I also asked about the effect that wind turbines have on a number of services and things within the community. Here you'll see I changed the scale a little bit. So now there is a gray category that's it's neither improved nor worsened. So in blue you have people who say that the wind development has improved local roads, and in orange it's people who say the wind development has worsened local roads. The story here is that most people say that wind development has no impact on local roads. The people who say it's worsened really aren't so much talking about the quality of the roads as the fact that there's traffic during construction. The people who say that roads have improved, there's a couple things going on. First of all, in Michigan, a lot of our local governments require the wind developer to post a bond or to prepare the roads for the heavy equipment that's going to be going down them. So if any damage is done, the wind developer does come back and repair it. Also, as I said earlier, wind developers are paying property taxes. In Michigan rural governments, most of that money is going towards road maintenance. And so there is some recognition that indeed those tax revenues are going to improve the roads. But again, most people say that roads haven't changed as a result of wind development. Township Services asking this question, I was trying to get at, what is the local government? Are you feeling the effects that the local government is doing with those tax revenues that are coming in? And here you can see 73% of residents say that their township services have not improved. Few people say that township services have worsened, and some say that they've improved. What is striking to me is that in Huron County, $2.6 million went to townships as a result of wind development in 1 year alone. And in one of my townships, property tax revenues quintupled. They went up 500%. When you talk to the township supervisor, they are taking that money and putting it towards roads, but they believe, and I think this makes sense, it's human nature, it's difficult to imagine what would have happened had wind development not been there. You don't know how many miles of road would have been paved, or how many miles of road would have been re-graveled, or dust treatment applied once rather than 3 times that year. And so local officials will tell me this is great for our township revenue. Local residents say they just don't see it. The same is true for county services. Most people say that county services have not improved. It's only 18% who say they have. Again, Huron County, $2.8 million went just to the county government. Huron County took that money and put it towards their retiree healthcare, their OPEB fund. So it puts the county in a better financial position, but residents aren't seeing that anything has really changed in their day-to-day lives in the county. In part, they just don't know what would have happened had the retiree healthcare fund been left underfunded. Same story is true on schools. So 64% say that local schools have neither improved nor worsened. About a third say that local schools have improved. One of the things that's really ironic in this research is that the way that school funding works in Michigan is that the local districts, this $2.7 million $2.07 million that's paid to local districts, actually doesn't stay at the local level. It's distributed on a per pupil basis across the state. So the local district actually hasn't changed. It's the intermediate school district, the regional districts that do get to keep that money. And a colleague of mine has done some research on what ISDs are doing, and they're trying to take away they're trying to fund some of the things that local districts normally fund. But again, it's the school's impact that you would expect local or residents to say haven't benefited, but in fact, they're more likely to say that the schools have benefited. Finally, I often hear, we don't want wind development to come here because it's gonna rip apart this community. It's gonna ruin relationships that we have with our neighbors. In the communities in Michigan that have had wind development, 64% say relationships with neighbors have neither improved nor worsened. Now it's true, 30% say, if they say it's changed, more have said that it worsens, but it's 30% compared to 64% that say relationships haven't changed. So the takeaways that I see here is that most residents do see job creation as a benefit, but they have a caveat about the types of jobs that are created. The majority haven't felt changes to community services or schools. And I think that's a result of a couple of things. Increasing cost of services and declining revenues over time in Michigan local governments generally may make those impacts less visible. I think it's also a function of our property tax structure in that local governments are given, get the most money in year one, and that quickly declines. And so it doesn't make sense for them to introduce a new service just to have to take that service away 10 years from now when the wind revenues go down to 30%. A majority of respondents don't think that wind has divided their communities. And I would add that this is in some pretty contentious projects. The most contentious projects in the state are ones that I surveyed, rather than the ones that are put up as national examples, because I want the realistic sense of what impacts these have. So while I come from a rural community and I know it's a problem if 30% of neighbors don't like each other, it's not quite as dire as what the news media would have you believe. So far, I have not talked at all about climate, and I put this slide kind of in a weird place because typically when I go around to communities, I don't talk about climate. The reason being, on the survey, one of the questions that I asked is whether wind turbines help limit climate change. There is more disagreement with that statement than agreement. It's 39% who agree that turbines help limit climate change, 51% who disagree. Statistically, there is no difference between whether you're paid or unpaid. So this is 57% of landowners with a turbine on their property who disagree that turbines help limit climate change. Generally speaking, I have found talking about climate to be counterproductive in these communities. If they're going to accept wind energy, if they're going to welcome wind energy, they're going to do it for non-climate reasons. Instead, we have, when you do talk about climate, you hear a lot of concern about what the liberal folks who live in the cities who voted for the state's renewable portfolio standard, how they're foisting this wind development on these rural communities. And so I think it's better, as you'll see in a minute, to really think about wind energy as an economic development opportunity or proposition. I've got 2 more slides, just so you know, and then I'm going to stop for questions about the data that I found before moving on to what I think this means for rural communities. So if you have questions, go ahead and submit them to Tyler. Okay, so overall then, I've talked about what the impacts are on the individual level and on the community level, but generally speaking, would people in these communities in Michigan with wind development welcome additional wind development? And I measure that 2 ways. So first, I ask about their quality, what impact the wind development has had on their quality of life. Overall, 55% say that their quality of life has neither improved nor worsened as a result of the wind development. So here, 16% say life's gotten better, 29% say that quality of life in the township has worsened, but most people say it hasn't had an impact. The other way that I ask about this, the proof in the pudding, is are you willing to host additional turbines in your township? And attitudes are really split. So 42% say yes, they support hosting additional wind development. 36% say they oppose it, and then you've got this balance in the middle that's, that say they neither support nor oppose it. What I think is most notable is if you'll notice the difference between paid and unpaid. Yes, it's a majority of people who are receiving a check in the mail now from a wind developer who say they want more wind development in their community. But even those who are unpaid, 38% say they support additional wind development compared to 40% who say that they oppose it. So there's no statistical difference really. It's a 50-50 split here among this unpaid group. All right, before I move on to the lessons learned, Tyler, did anything else come in?
Yeah, one question is if this information is published anyplace. They said it was good information and they'd like to share. So.
Yeah, so I am a terrible academic. No, I've published this in a chapter. I have in a book, a peer-reviewed book. I have a couple things under peer review right now. Honestly, I like to write for local audiences, and so I have a number of things that are available on the website at the end that I can point you to. I just wrote a series of articles for the Michigan Association of Planning. So it's really focused on planners, and one is specifically, what does this mean for farming communities? So yeah, I'll point you to that at the end. Good question.
Okay. That's it for now.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, so what lessons do I share? And this is something that I talked a bit about in the articles that I just wrote for the Michigan Association of Planning. I am a planner, and so I will tell you that I think that the first thing that you should ask is, how does wind development fit with your long-term plan? And I would propose that wind development is an economic development opportunity for rural communities, but it may not be a good fit for all communities. If your goal in your community, as you've identified through your master plan or other documents, is for substantial residential development or growth of tourism, I think wind development may not be right. The reason is that these landowners, if you're building a new house or, you know, in a subdivision, if we're talking substantial residential development, we're talking like mass production, or if you want people to be building new vacation homes, they're going to have smaller plots of land generally, and they are, as a result, going to be less likely to directly benefit. They may not be getting that check in the mail. So we know that that check in the mail does have some impact on attitudes. But more so than that, some of these people who would be building a new house may be deterred from building as a result of the wind development. A lot of these folks who would be, you know, who want to move to the country, either to retire or, you know, just to get out of the city and commute into the city, do so to go to a place where they can have peace and quiet and they can see the night stars, night sky. And wind development, wind turbines can certainly impinge upon that. And so it's reasonable to believe that you're going to deter, maybe not everybody, but at least some portion of potential home builders by having wind development in your community. If your goal is to sustain agriculture, I think that wind development can fit. It provides income diversification for farmers, and it helps them shore up their succession plans. This in turn might help stabilize the population in some of these communities that are losing young folks. And it's adding to the tax base, which is really important too. I certainly, you know, I started all of this research with a concern over farmland preservation and keeping farmland from being developed. What I found is that some wind developers prefer to site on property lines, and doing that actually can take very little land out of production. If you're building on that access road on a fence row that wasn't farmed anyway, it's very possible to do this with taking 0 acres out of production. As a result, Michigan's statewide farmland preservation program, where you can enroll your land in exchange for promising not to develop it for the next, you know, for a set period of time, has ruled that wind energy is compatible. We don't have the same ruling right now on solar, so I'm happy to talk about that a little bit, but even our state farmland preservation program has said that wind development is compatible with that. I also tell communities that, so once you decide whether or not it fits in with your long-term plan, your zoning should match what that plan is, should match what that goal is. So right now there is, in Michigan, legal uncertainty about whether you can zone out wind, if you can say like wind turbines aren't allowed. What I've seen based on, you know, looking across the state is that it is very possible to create a legitimate zoning ordinance that either minimizes or maximizes opportunities for turbines. The way that you minimize or maximize is through what setback distances you use and what noise limits you use and some other requirements, either being very onerous or not so onerous. And I suggest to communities, especially if you can do this before a wind development is proposed, that your zoning ordinance can send a message that you are open for business and you want wind developers to come, or you are not interested. The project, one of the projects in the state that I did not survey, what is in Gratiot County, it's set up as a model nationwide. They are not the windiest place in the state, but all of the townships worked together to create an ordinance that definitely sent the message that we are open for business. We want wind development here. And by God, they have the state's largest wind farm. So they're not the windiest place, but they have a zoning ordinance that says we want wind development here. And so I think you can certainly send that message through your zoning ordinance. I these are irrelevant for people that aren't in Michigan, but here I've, accumulated a list of guidance and sample zoning ordinances. But the caveat that I always tell people is this part in blue here. You certainly can look to other communities in terms of what they're doing on their zoning ordinance, but you really need to consider whether those communities do or do not have turbines, because there is no rhyme or reason, honestly, to what their setback distances are. But those setback distances are really important to whether or not you're going to be able to site turbines. And so if the community does not have wind turbines, if they have 2 mile setback distance and they don't have wind turbines, if you follow that, you're unlikely to have wind turbines as well. So that's just something to keep in mind. The other thing that I often talk about is, and I just alluded to this, is that there really is not an ideal zoning ordinance to ensure community happiness and a sense of comfort that wind development, that if a wind project is built there, that the ordinance is going to protect the neighbors. So the evidence that I give for this is that in the places where I have worked, these are the setback distances. So over here on the right, this is the largest setback distance. It's 1,320 feet from property line. And you work your way smaller and smaller until you get over to here on the left, this unzoned township. Wind development is a private agreement between the landowner and the wind developer. There are no rules. So you could set it right on your property line, so long as it's on your property and not your neighbor's property. What this is showing is the percentage of residents in that community that say they support or oppose additional wind turbines in their township. And it's the unzoned township and this township with more lax zoning standards where there are more people in support. In this township where generally this is, 1,320 foot setback is generally seen as something that's protecting of the neighbors, it's not enough to satisfy those neighbors. They do not want any additional wind development there, even though their ordinance should be protecting them from any negative impacts on their property. More important, and this is not just my study that's found this, but other studies nationwide, is that it's not so much the specifics in the zoning ordinance that lead people to feel comfortable about a project. It's more about whether they had an opportunity to participate and how they felt about the wind developer. So here's that same information about whether the dark blue, the bars here are about whether they support or oppose additional wind turbines in their community. But here across the bottom, this is the people who strongly agree that they had an ample opportunity to provide input during the planning project stage, to those who strongly disagree. So what I hope you see here is that if you strongly agree that you had input in the first wind project, you support additional wind development. If you disagree that you had input in the first wind project, you don't want any more wind development to happen in your community. The same is true based on how you feel about the wind developer. So if you strongly agree that the wind developer acted openly and transparently, you support additional wind development. If you disagree, if you think that the wind developer wasn't open and transparent, you strongly oppose additional wind development. Now, one of the things that struck me, because I'm talking to a non-Michigan audience, is like, what's going on in Michigan? Because if you read the really good work that Lawrence Berkeley National Labs has done, a nationwide survey of people living in communities with wind development, you would say the story for Michigan is not quite what Berkeley's found. They found 57% overall support for the wind farm. Only 6% were annoyed by noise. 69% found turbines visually attractive. I don't have the exact same question, so it's difficult to be directly comparable, but mine is definitely not quite as happy of a story as what Lawrence Berkeley National Lab found. So there are things that I found in terms of overall drivers of attitudes, or at least correlates, that they also found. So attitudes about process and the wind developer are really important, and they published a study on that. So that's where we agree that direct compensation makes a difference. Maybe it doesn't. Their study found that it's maybe not important when you factor in a whole bunch of other things, but if you just break down the numbers based on who's paid and unpaid, that generally speaking, compensation, people who are compensated are happier. that it makes a difference about whether you can actually hear the turbines versus not in terms of how you feel about them. But from my travels, I seem to feel that, and what I found in the survey is that what kind of land you own also is a driver of how you feel about the wind development. So regardless of all of these other things going on, generally in my survey, I found that people who own secondary homes are less supportive of wind development and find that they have more negative impacts than people whose primary residence is in the community. That makes sense. If you have a secondary home or vacation home to get away from the noise and the lights, you definitely see those impacts of wind turbines on that. I've also found that people who just own farmland and don't own a residence at all tend to be the happiest. They're more likely to be compensated, but also they don't have that those turbines in their backyard effectively. In Michigan, we have a lot, our farming communities are rarely exclusively agricultural. We have a whole lot of inland lakes. And so we have a lot of places where we have folks with secondary homes right up next to the farmers. My very first public hearing that I went to in Michigan, when I went in, I was asked if I was there with the farmers or if I was there with the Lakers. So this is something that I'm certainly seeing in Michigan, that in a nationwide sample, I think you're not picking up necessarily on some of these differences. There's just not, maybe Michigan is weird. So that led to this research that I've been doing this summer, which is looking at Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Minnesota, places that also have interior lakes, where there's this mix of landowners, places where there are lots of folks that may be commuting from these rural communities to more urban centers. And so they are choosing to build a house in the country, to enjoy the peace and quiet, and may have different reactions towards wind development. What I wanted to know is if you could predict where wind development will be contentious using data sets that are able to measure. Down here you can see agricultural characteristics, land use characteristics, demographics, social media. It was a survey of 46 experts. Most of them were wind developers. And I asked them to rate the contention of the projects that they were familiar with in these states. And clearly, the 2-minute summary is that 16 of these variables were important to predict contention. You could predict it 81% of the time within 1 point on a 10-point scale, within a point and a half, 93% of the time. And it's really those agricultural and place attachment characteristics that were most important or most significant. So people in communities where there are more people with primary occupation as farmers, or where there are more farm operators who are not residing on the farm, there was less contention about the wind development. In places where there was less loss of agricultural acreage, it was less contentious. Communities where they were where USDA had identified them as recreation dependent county projects, wind energy was more contentious. In communities where the US Census has the population with a long commute, so a 40-minute commute, or more people with a bachelor's degree, those projects in those communities were more contentious. There are a number of characteristics that I found were not significant. You can see those here. But overall, what I think this means is that this farmer versus amenity seeker conflict is present beyond Michigan. It's at least present in Minnesota, Indiana, and Illinois, as well as Michigan. And it may be possible to predict where there's going to be a battle over wind development. My concluding thoughts, because I've got 10 minutes left, one final slide, so do keep questions coming in if you have any, is that I think that it's really helpful to be proactive in outreach. Honestly, it would be great if communities decided before a wind development is proposed whether wind development is an economic development tool that fits in their community. Like if they have a zoning ordinance on the books, that would be ideal. It's really difficult, at least in Michigan, to prompt people to be proactive if they don't know if wind development could happen there. it's also proactive, helpful to be proactive as soon as the project is announced. So oftentimes communities call me in to talk about the pros and cons once everybody has already made up their mind and there are already clear community divisions, and they say, wait, we got to figure out what's fact from fiction. It would be a whole lot easier if everybody, if they got this kind of information before things got to that point. I haven't yet figured out how to get into communities early enough, but welcome your feedback on that. But if you are in a situation where you can encourage these conversations earlier, I think it can only lead to more positive outcomes, because it's not the wind farm itself that can be divisive, just the idea of talking about a project that's already being proposed can be divisive. We probably won't have time to talk about this much today, but I found that state policy matters. So the tax structure, I think, is leading to a couple of problems in Michigan, because residents just aren't feeling the benefits of the taxes that are being paid. Citing authority also has a big impact. So whether you're cited at the township level versus the county level versus the state level makes a big difference about how much people feel like they have a say in what's happening, and can certainly have an impact on wind farm outcomes. And finally, my concluding thought is I really welcome your knowledge about how this matches your state's experience, or if you're really interested in collaborating. I'm realizing that I think I've got a handle on how things work in Michigan, but I'd love to learn what's working well elsewhere to bring it back here. So, as promised, this website goes to a page where I have a whole bunch of things that I've written. Again, most of it is not peer reviewed. If you check out my CV, you'll see the couple of things that have been peer reviewed. Most of this is the summaries that I provide to communities about what my research has found. And feel free to contact me if I don't answer your questions, or I do and you just want more. So Tyler, I will stop talking so you can tell me what people want to know about.
Yeah, great. Thanks. That was very good. We do have a couple questions, and then as you listen to these, other people can chime into the chat box or the Q&A. John asked, what has the reaction from the public been? It seems like these results don't play to the confirmation bias of people who like or dislike wind farms.
Yeah, so I am very used to going into a community and managing to upset everybody, because for the pro-wind people, I say things that they don't like, inconvenient truths, I call them. And for the folks who don't want wind development in their community, they don't like that I talk about this being really good for farmers. So it's not comfortable. But this is among the reasons that I think it's helpful to have early on in the conversation, so that people can see that there's a lot of shades of gray in this. Once you've already set up your mind that this is an awful thing for your community or a great thing for your community, it's really difficult to be open to the fact that, wait, there is another side to this.
Okay, thanks. Another question, and you maybe kind of touched on this the last few slides, but it was put up a little bit longer ago. Pete says, perceptions are interesting. You seem to have actual facts that complement the perception data. Is it possible for you to present this in a way that compares the perceptions with the actual impacts?
Yeah, so I try to do that. I should probably put more of that into the slides. Yeah, that's great feedback.
Okay. Another question from Fritz. How often do wind developers do things like oil and gas pooling for landowners? Have you seen communities pool their interests?
Yeah, so Fritz, you may have been on or maybe not from the very early slides about the different wind development models in Michigan. The first wind developer who started the kind of pooled royalties model was also an oil and gas developer. So that's certainly, we're seeing it. It's spreading through Michigan. I don't think that there are any projects in Michigan that are being proposed right now that don't pool royalties. What we haven't seen in Michigan is communities like farmers associations who get together effectively and say, we're all willing to approach a wind developer. We're going to talk about what our lease agreements, what the terms that we want to see in a lease agreement are. I haven't seen that yet, but certainly the royalty pooling is that's what wind developers are moving to. They have to in Michigan.
Okay, next one from Christy. How far are the turbines from homes?
It depends greatly on the project, and it depends on, you know, a lot of that is because as a result of the zoning. So I don't have that. That's not something that I've specifically looked at, but I'm happy to talk to you a little bit more offline, Christy.
Okay, thanks. Jeffrey asks, is it possible that wind farms don't necessarily lead to investment, but in fact it is property investment that leads perhaps indirectly to wind farms, or that the two variables are related in another way?
Yeah, it could be. And that's something that I really grappled with early on in the very first study where I'm looking at investment in wind farms. The communities with wind farms have not been proactive in going out. It's not the farmers who say like, wind developer, come here. Other than the one community in Michigan that did that, that's not the case in the ones that I have studied. And so you would imagine that there shouldn't be something different by having these control communities in place. It should account for that. The fact that there are wealthy farms, you know, everything else was similar in these communities except the size of the farms, the revenues, the landowner, farm revenues were similar. It's just when I asked them how much they were investing in the more recent time period, that's where you saw the changes as a result of the wind development. So I think I have the data to be able to differentiate between that. But if you're interested in helping me, Jeffrey, contact me.
Okay, John asks, how does Michigan compare to other states in terms of favorable characteristics for wind energy production?
Good question. So we are not the windiest state by any means. We do have a renewable portfolio standard that has not been fulfilled yet. We had met our 10% target for 2015. We have 15% by 2021. Every wind developer that I talk to says that there's certainly a market. Both utilities and local and businesses are looking to build wind farms in Michigan, that it is really hard to get projects sited here. In part because we have this local land use control, which is good if you've got communities that want to reduce barriers to make it really easy to site wind farms. Right now, most communities are blocking wind farm development, and so I think that the market is there. It's the social acceptance side that right now is really tough in Michigan, but it's not. Michigan's not alone, and I actually think there's a number of states that are part of this group. The same discussions are going on in Indiana and Minnesota. We're not as windy as Minnesota, but in terms of seeing the same sort of pushback from local communities, I think that there's similarities.
Okay, Gary asks, I have visited a number of wind farms and have experienced no noise whatsoever. What is the source of this concern?
Good question, Gary. A lot of people say the same thing. And this is the situation where, you know, LBNL study finds 6% of people are bothered by the noise from turbines, 6% of everybody in that area. And that most people can't hear them at all from their house. I think it's 80% say that they can't hear the wind turbine from their house. So why in Michigan we see so much more concern is a really good question. I don't know. I think it is in part because we have non-farmers in these communities who have different expectations. Right now, you know, they talk about how they don't like the hog farm that's down the road, and they don't like, you know, particular farming practices. In many ways, and I wrote about this recently, I think that we're seeing the same dynamic that gave rise to the right to farm laws, right to farm acts in every state coming back over this issue. I think that that's why we see such differences, but I haven't delved enough into that to say definitively.
Okay, Next question is from Barry. Are there applications to solar farms?
Yes. So solar farms, my like 2-minute version on solar farms is that generally speaking, there are fewer landowners involved. So fewer people are going to directly economically benefit. Solar farms are paying property taxes. Michigan hasn't sorted out what the tax structure is going to look like, and I'm then trying to make sure that my research on wind can be used so that the same mistakes made on wind aren't made on solar on the taxation side of things. You don't have the same, while there are certainly people that are concerned about the look, the aesthetics of solar farms, that's much more limited to a drive-by impact rather than, you know, being able to see the wind turbine 7 miles away. But again, with a farmland preservation hat on now, there are definitely considerations, and communities are trying to figure out, like, is this the best use of this farmland? And so there's a lot of discussion about planting pollinator species between the solar panels. But some additional research I did this summer is finding, like, generally speaking, state farmland preservation programs that have talked about solar say that it's inappropriate on preserved farmland just because it takes up, utility scale solar takes up too much land. And that's not the case on utility scale wind.
Okay. Cheryl asks, did you find any indicators of how to handle the challenge of competing developers when it comes to earlier proactive outreach?
No, and so that's what I think that wind developers in particular are taking the findings, well, to some extent from my research, but more from, you know, LBNL, and saying, okay, we know that how we're perceived in the community is important to how people feel about the project, but like, how early can we be involved without like tipping off our competitors? And does being involved early actually lead to more time for any anti-wind organizers or any anti-wind activists to organize? So I haven't dealt with that, but that's a really good question.
Okay. Someone from Purdue Extension says they're having a powwow about this tonight at their planning commission. They said they have a farmer versus farmer wanting or not wanting the wind farm, and then asks, have you done anything on Flickr?
So I didn't ask about Flickr. LBNL did ask about Flickr. It's a very small portion that are concerned by Flickr, and Flickr effects are really limited in terms of like the proximity from the turbine. You can see the turbine itself, the red lights from much farther away than the Flickr would have effects on. From what I say about Flickr is how many people write about it on my, you know, on that last page of my survey. And I had literally like a handful, maybe 5 comments about Flickr from all 2,000 surveys. Many more comments, I think, you know, 8 times as many comments on the red lights. So most wind developers are expected to do Flickr studies. You know, local zoning ordinances can often require screening for it. I just don't see that that's the biggest issue. It's something that people can talk about and that can be measured, but I don't think that that's the primary concern in most of the communities with wind farms.
Okay, thanks. John says, I see the amenity seeking populations challenge expanded livestock operations. These people seem to think the countryside should stay the same as when they move there. Yet I think when the entity is local, it gets less negative reaction than when a multinational company comes in. Wind is almost always seen as multinational. It's more of a comment than a question.
Yeah, I think that you're right. I think what's interesting is in Michigan, our utility, we have 2 major utilities, Detroit, DTE, Detroit Edison, effectively to most people, is one of them, not a multinational. They're seen in not all that differently than the, you know, bigger multinationals that have developed here. I see no effect on that. So we don't, like I said, we don't have community wind, we don't have community developed projects, but we do have projects that are from Michigan companies, and I haven't seen a difference in the community reaction to them.
Okay, thanks. Will asks, he joined on late, but he's got an interest in the health impacts in particular. And so he said that for those that feel that health has been affected, what specific issues are they seeing? He says to restate that, what health issues are measurably and actually affecting them?
Yeah, and that's one where I didn't follow up on that question about what the health impacts are. I have a list of things that can have some students go through the open ends to see if people gave more details, and I'm going to write that on my list because I think that's a good one. I've gotten that a couple of times. I don't know right now, but I'm guessing that I do have some of that data. So if you're interested and you want to look at the raw data, let me know.
Okay, thanks. And then Barry asked a couple follow-up questions. He asked about the solar, and I think you touched on if there would be any similarities to research with wind and solar. But he also mentions that he's from Wisconsin, and they're putting in a large solar farm there. So, Merrill asks, what are the keys to solar development on PA 116 land? And how can we get MDARD, MDARD to seriously look at solar on land in PA 116? I'm assuming you know that must be wind lingo.
Yes. So PA 116 is the state's farmland preservation program. I took that out. So Merrill must be a Michigander. Hi. Merrill, please contact me because that's something that I've been thinking about a lot. That's in part why this summer I had a student look at every farmland preservation program in the country. So all 50 states, most states have multiple aspects of farmland preservation to try to understand who has talked about wind or solar and whether they allow it or not. So right now, Michigan's program requires that if you want to put utility scale solar on land that's enrolled in PA 116, you have to pay the back tax penalty on that. That land has to be rezoned, not just like, it has to be rezoned as industrial. And so it's really seen as a challenge. So, but contact me because I've got a lot more information and maybe that's a project together.
All right, and the last one, I think, till someone types one in. Pete asks, any ideas on how to replicate the survey of perceptions in communities where the wind is 20, 30, or more years old?
Yeah, so you could certainly do it. I mean, to some extent, that's, well, the LBNL study limited their selection to more recent projects, but I don't see why you couldn't. I have like I've done a decent amount of work in survey research, and so it's hard to ask people like how they felt before the project went in. That's not what my survey does anyway. I just ask what are your impressions of wind that's already there? What are your impressions today? So what my survey doesn't do is be able to track how their attitudes have changed over time. And if you've got a project that's 20 or 30 years old, you're not going to be able to go back and see what it was then. But yeah, there's certainly nothing stopping you. So feel free to reach out to me and I can, share the survey itself. The survey itself is on the website, right? That's on the screen right now. But I'm happy to share any other pointers.
Okay, well that concludes the questions that I have anyway, so hopefully I didn't miss anyone. If I did, type really fast and I'll catch you before we cut it off. But thanks, Sarah. I appreciate it. It was very interesting. I found all the survey data quite interesting as well. And coming from a trained climatologist, I didn't know I was going to have to be a sociologist, and you probably thought maybe the same thing. And so it's interesting how people and us think. So I do appreciate the insights, and obviously it was very well received. So interesting topic, and for everyone on, we will make this recording available soon. And then obviously you can see the website there available if you'd like any more information on this. So anyway, I don't see any more questions. Our next webinar in this series will be in 2 months on October 22nd. So you can look for more information as well on that. But with that, I'll go ahead and conclude the webinar. So thanks again, everyone, for joining. Appreciate it.